Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Positivist School. Today we are going to focus on Cesar Lombroso. Again, I've also heard his name pronounced as Cesare, but I refer to it as Cesar Lombroso. And this is a really interesting theory because this is the only theory I'm going to teach you that has been formally debunked, meaning it has very little weight to it. It has none, actually. But we study it because of its historical value. Um, it's really interesting thing about theories. You can never, ever, ever prove a theory, right? You can't prove a theory, but you can disprove. You can disprove a theory. You can have a lot of empirical support that really indicates that the theory is valuable, full of weight, and it predicts as it says, but there's no way to fully, completely, verify a theory, but you can debunk one. And the positivist school by Cesar Lombroso has in fact been debunked. So this is a theory that was created in 1859. So we're talking, a good bit of time ago. And it was developed by Lombroso, and he wrote his large treatise called The Criminal Man. He was labeled as the father of modern criminology because and the reason we study him and the reason that this is famous, even though, it's been debunked, is that he was the first theorist to try and focus on tangible biological factors as an explanation to criminal engagement. He was also the first theorist to conduct research. So prior to Lombroso, we have the classical theory, we have Jeremy Bentham, we have Caesar, the other Caesar whose name is escaping me right now. They did not conduct research. They just formed a theory, but they never tested it, right? They never had any sort of empirical research data to test the rigors of whether or not what they were saying is true. And Lombroso was the first person to actually gather data and test, which is why this is famous and we still study it. So he was a military nurse, and during his time as a military nurse, in battle, he was able to, in the process of treating wounded soldiers, he started to gather data. And he was able to measure 3,000 soldiers and document physical and biological differences in those soldiers relative to the general population. So arguably, he found, his findings they're very rudimentary and they don't pan out. So there's things like this. So people with tattoos, especially obscene tattoos, are more likely to be criminals versus non-criminals. Well, at the time, this was revolutionary, but please remember it was also 1859, right? People knew a lot less. The average person wasn't educated, etc. Certainly tattoos are not a precursor or an indicator of crime. When I teach this class on ground, I like to take the time to see how many people in the class have tattoos, and it's almost always everybody. I am one of the rare people that does not have a tattoo. But certainly we're not all criminals, right? It's a form of body art. But it was the first time somebody said, hey, look, I can point to something tangible on the body that is going to tell us whether or not you have a higher likelihood of engaging in crime. Other things that he measured and, the data he collected was that he found that the soldiers who were more likely to engage in crime, had an unusual size of ear. They had a strange slope to their foreheads. They had excessively long arms, receding chins, and twisted noses were indicative of features of criminals. Now, all of these things, arguably, are silly, number one, and number two, have roots that are based in racism, which is where this has largely been debunked. But from this data, Lombroso classified 4 categories of criminals, and the first is going to be a born criminal. And he calls these people with atavistic characteristics. And atavistic means sort of ancient, a throwback, antiquated. They haven't evolved fully. These are people, he says, that are literally physically behind on the evolutionary scale. And therefore, they're less sophisticated and they're less controlled than somebody who's fully evolved. So they don't make good decisions and they can't control impulses and they engage in crime. So that's a born criminal. Number 2 is he defines as the insane criminal, and he literally defines this as idiots, imbeciles, paranoiacs, and epileptics. So let's talk about those words for a minute. Largely, we use those as pejoratives, but in 1859, idiot and imbecile were actually medical terminology for people with cognitive disabilities, for people with mental illness. They have over time changed meaning to be just hurtful and ugly. But at this point, when he's using these terms, they were literally diagnostic criteria. But he's saying people with mental illness, people with cognitive disabilities, people who suffer from paranoia, people who suffer from epilepsy, which is not a cognitive disability or a mental illness, it's a physical illness. He said that these are all insane criminals, that there's something wrong with the function of the mind, and therefore they can't make proper decisions and they are likely to engage in criminality. He said the same was also true of alcoholics, right? And we know that alcoholism certainly has a genetic component. There's no question to that. It's a huge predisposition. But it doesn't mean that everybody who drinks alcohol is a criminal. And it doesn't mean everybody who is an alcoholic is a criminal. Number three is the occasional criminal or the criminaloid. That's the same category. He used those terms interchangeably. And he argues that crimes are explained by opportunity, but it's also those who have innate traits who take that opportunity. So meaning that, crime is opportunistic, which other theorists have subsequently argued. But there are some people who are just simply predisposed, and when they're more likely to be criminal on the basis of their biological makeup. And when they're presented with that opportunity, they can't help themselves because of that biological predisposition. So they engage in crime. And the fourth category is criminals of passion. And this is not necessarily somebody who has a biological predisposition, but these are people who engage in crime as a result of the way we biologically function in reaction and emotion, such as being very angry, crimes of jealousy, crimes of anger, crimes in the heat of passion, crimes of honor. These would all be considered criminals of passion. So concepts of Lombroso were developed over the years, well beyond 1859, well into the early 1900s. This was still it was in vogue, and it was actually it was relatively popular in the early 1910s, 1920s. This is where phrenology developed out of. If you are aware of what phrenology is, it's where they, would feel a person's head for the different dents and bumps or whatever. And if you have like more of a prominent bump right here, well, that would mean something about your behavior. If you had a bigger dent right here, that would mean something else. And supposedly we could predict behavior based on how your skull is shaped, that it was, you're biologically born this way. We've certainly debunked phrenology as pseudoscience, right? And given that it grew out of Lombroso, that's even more support for the fact that Lombroso's theory is a whole lot of silliness. But again, if he's pseudoscience, why do we study him? Because he's the first to introduce tangible research, and he's also the first to investigate biological origins of criminality. So he did make significant contributions to criminology, even though his contributions were largely racist and have been debunked, right? He introduced the idea of empirical support. Look, you can't just come up with a theory and shoot from the hip. You got to come up with a theory and then you got to back it up with data. He introduced the idea that there could be biological influences over behavior that people have no or less control over that results in crime. So he introduced concepts that have been developed down the line. So ultimately, the only policy that is to be taken from Lombroso's assertions is incapacitation. He argued that, look, there's something biologically wrong, different, predisposed, or malfunctioning about every category of criminal. Because it's biological, because they're born this way, and remember, we're in 1859, he's like, there's nothing we can do about it. We don't have any treatments. We don't have any medications. I mean, they certainly didn't have antidepressants or antipsychotics or anti-anxieties in 1859. So there was no treatment. There was no therapy. There was no cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's nothing we can do about these people. And they pose a threat to society, so we have to incapacitate them. We literally just put them in prison for long periods of time where they can't harm society, right? And certainly, if indeed Lombroso was correct that there are these biological predispositions or problems in an individual, is it ethical, is it moral to lock them up for the rest of their lives over something that is innate and inherent to their biology that they were born with, that for which there's no treatment? Probably not, right? So even the policy implications here were poorly constructed. Right. Ultimately, this Lombroso's theory sort of contributed to the concept of social Darwinism. Darwinian theory was really prominent at the time of Lombroso's theory, and in the Victorian era in general. And the idea here was just let nature take its course, that these people are biologically inferior. They will be the weakest, not the fittest, and eventually they will just die out of the population and they will stop passing their, negative genetics onto their offspring. Unfortunately, this could get very dangerous, and it did, because this social Darwinism plus Lombroso's theory on positivism gave birth to what we call the eugenics movement, and it gave steam to the eugenics movement. And the eugenics movement was a group of people in the early 1900s who basically said, we want to find a way to remove criminals and undesirables from the gene pool. Right? We want to prevent them from perpetuating more harm to society. When they pass on these criminal genes, they're just breeding more little criminals that are going to harm the rest of us. So their solution was, we need to stop you from doing that. And the way they would do that is through forced sterilization. That if you were a criminal, if you were arrested, if you were involved in the system, therefore you had this biological internalization or this existence that is passed down through the genes. It's not your fault. You can't control it, but we can stop you from passing it on to your offspring by not letting you have offspring, right? And not allowing reproduction to occur. So that was yet another form of incapacitation that was introduced, and this was carried out for a very long time. The eugenics movement resulted in legislation that mandated sterilization, legally mandated sterilization, for certain behavioral traits that were determined to be criminal in nature, genetic traits that were criminal in nature. So the law targeted traits such as criminality, alcoholism, sodomy, bestiality, feeble-mindedness, which is simply just, low IQ or being cognitively disabled. And they would, identify these individuals and sterilize them. 64,000 people were sterilized under the eugenics initiative until this was finally brought to the courts as inherently in violation of the Constitution, of equal protection, of illegal search and seizure, and it was overturned in the 1970s. So this is a practice that was abandoned in the 1970s, but it's also it's very telling. It's very telling of the power of theory and explanation and how it can drive policy and legislation that could be very helpful or could be very harmful, or in some cases it could be really unethical and immoral. And this is why we still study Lombroso, because fail as he did, he still introduced a myriad of things. The idea of research, the idea of biology as a driving factor in criminality, and the demonstration of how very badly this can go, right? How very badly and how things can go off the rails and get very unethical and very immoral very quickly. And ultimately, the positivist school lives on, not through Lombroso's nonsense, but there is the idea of DNA technology. With the advent of DNA technology, there became the resurgence and of interest in biological explanations of criminality, and therefore it eventually made its way back. But for the longest time after the 1970s, nobody would touch it. It was really a black eye of racism and impropriety and lack of ethics and morality. So nobody wanted to touch positivism. It wasn't until the 90s, mid 90s or so, that other theorists said, let's take another stab at this. That, look, Lombroso was really wrong and it ended really badly. However, it doesn't mean that there isn't something to investigate here and see if we can't identify and provide solutions to problems. And we will follow that up later in the term with Moffat and her life course persistent offending.